In the Pokemon TCG, just like in any card game, or game in general, there are fundamental rules that every player has to follow. In Pokemon, each player sets out 6 prize cards at the start of the game, draws 7 cards for their opening hand, and must place a basic Pokemon from their hand into their active spot face down. Then once both players set up, the game commences. But what if I told you that almost every single one of these quote-unquote rules I've just laid out have been broken in some way, and actually that almost every rule in the entire game has been broken by the game designers? However, this does exclude one major rule, and it's one rule that Pokemon isn't just afraid to break, but it's one that they never will. Because despite this rule never being broken literally, we've already seen what it would mean for competitive play if it were to be broken, and how detrimental to the game it would be. So today I'm here to break down why Pokemon hasn't broken its most fundamental rule, the one time you could actually play the game without this rule in place, why it was so bad for the game, and why the Pokemon TCG will ultimately never go that far. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy. Now let's get started. So what is this rule I keep yapping about? Well, it's one that anyone who's ever played the Pokemon TCG has done countless times, multiple times per game. I'm of course talking about drawing a card to start your turn. Well, drawing one card to start every turn, while it might seem simple, and it is simple, it has been the bedrock of the game since the very beginning. And to be honest, it's not going anywhere. But to understand why, I think it'll be helpful if we go back in time and see when the other fundamental rules of Pokemon were broken and how that panned out. First, some of these rules haven't officially been broken in tournament play, but the rules of setting out 6 prize cards and having 60 cards in your deck have been broken for pre-release tournaments. Pre-release events are held in the weeks leading up to a major set release, and it allows fans to get the new cards early, open packs before anyone else, collect limited promo cards, and battle with 40 card decks featuring pre-made kits with new standout hits. However, in this format, deck size is limited to 40, and each player only sets out 4 prize cards to start the game. Of these rules, I think these ones specifically, if they were broken in competitive play, would break the game the most outside of drawing for turn. With EX Pokemon giving up 2 prize cards, Megas giving up 3 prize cards, and supporter and item cards that can dig through your deck, having just 4 prizes to take makes games fast to the point that a massive amount of skill is removed from gameplay. As it currently stands, the Pokemon TCG is about 90% skill and 10% variance/luck. So by making games faster and having less turns per game, it means that skill is less important as a factor. Instead of masterfully executing comebacks with Dragapult EX, you'd 100% be forced to go turbo with rare candies to avoid losing the game after just one Phantom Dive, let alone not even getting to announce the attack at all. But in pre-release, where not everyone has EX Pokemon or Mega Pokemon, and the most powerful trainers and attackers aren't always at their disposal, it kind of works. Another rule that is often broken is drawing 7 cards for your opening hand. Now, this isn't technically broken in every game of Pokemon you play, but mulligans do break this rule, since if your opponent mulligans and you don't, you're guaranteed to not start the game with 7 cards in your opening hand. This is very small, but it does make games pretty unique sometimes, and it's a healthy way of punishing decks that don't play many basic Pokemon in an attempt to start their most optimal one every game. Another rule that's been broken countless times involves how many prize cards you take for a knockout. Knocking out any regular Pokemon nets you 1 prize card. EX Pokemon, Pokemon V, etc. have rule boxes that state how many prizes they give up, and Pokemon VMAX, Tag Team GX, and Mega Evolution lowercase EX give up 3. The cheat here are attacks and abilities that allow you to take extra prize cards. Examples include Lugia EX from Plasma Storm and its ability, which allows you to take an extra prize card whenever it knocks something out, the infamous Iron Hands EX with its Amp You Very Much attack taking 1 extra prize, and of course Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia Tag Team GX's Altered Creation GX attack, which allows all future knockouts to take 1 more prize card if you KO the opponent's active Pokemon. Speaking of ADP, another rule that this card broke was how much damage your Pokemon should deal. Pokemon cards obviously have text displaying how much damage their attacks should deal, and ADP's GX attack makes all of your future attacks deal 30 extra damage for the rest of the game to the active Pokemon, breaking the very fabric of what the cards you're holding should do. The rule that you can only attach 1 energy card from your hand to a Pokemon each turn is actually the rule that is broken by far the most. The breaking of this rule is often how the best decks in the game set themselves apart from the pack. The most obvious examples are Gardevoir EX and its Psychic Embrace ability, accelerating as many psychic energy from the discard as you like to your psychic Pokemon, Archeops's Primal Turbo ability, taking 2 special energy out of your deck and attaching them to one of your Pokemon, and Blastoise's Deluge ability, allowing you to attach as many water energy from your hand to your Pokemon as you like. The rules regarding the phase in between turns, also known as Pokemon Checkup, have been broken by every attack that allows you to take an extra turn. We haven't had many of these, but the ones we had were extremely powerful. Dialga GX in its Timeless GX attack has been dominating the expanded format for years at this point. Origin form Dialga V-Star and its Star Chronos V-Star power has proven itself as a tournament winning strategy in the past, and Medicham V was actually just banned from the expanded format after its great showing in the standard format due to its Yoga Loop attack. Yoga Loop puts 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, but if you knock a Pokemon out with this attack, you get to take another turn after this one. Unlike both Dialga cards, Yoga Loop can be used as many times as you want per game, with the restriction being that if you took an extra turn with the Yoga Loop, and this is that extra turn, you can't use Yoga Loop again. Sticking with more fundamental rules regarding status conditions have always been pretty interesting. The rules regarding the Asleep status condition have been altered on multiple occasions, usually having to deal with how many coins you have to flip during Pokemon Checkup. In case you don't know, if a Pokemon is asleep, the user has to flip a coin during Pokemon Checkup, and if heads, that player's Pokemon wakes up and returns to normal, and if tails, it remains asleep, unable to attack or retreat for the full turn. Cards like Slumbering Forest and Darkrai Prism Star have been able to alter the amount of coins the user has to flip in order to wake up, usually requiring 2 heads in order to wake up. Slumbering Forest was actually pretty good in some control decks in 2020 because it paired well with Mareep. Mareep has an ability that if it's in the active spot, you can just make your opponent fall asleep, so it could force mathematically favorable situations for the Mareep user, and it bought you time that was valuable in setting up win conditions. In some Magcargo mill decks in 2020, for example, Slumbering Forest plus Mareep could be used in the early game to stall until you built up your mill combo. You would use Belelba and Bryson Man, which discards the top 3 cards of each player's deck, to mill out your opponent, while infinitely recovering resources with Orangaru's resource management attack. The strategy was actually so good that it got banned from the standard format in 2020. On the note of other status conditions, outside of Paralysis, every other one has cards that alter them in some way. For Poison, cards like Radiant Hisui and Sneasler have been able to amplify the damage that Poison does in between turns, increasing from the usual 10 to some arbitrary number. The same thing that went for Poison also goes for Burn most of the time, but there have been some pretty interesting stadium cards like Dizzying Valley and Dust Island that break the rules that when Pokemon evolve or switch out, their status conditions are removed. Before I get into the main topic of this video, I want to touch on some last few rules that have been broken. One being evolution. Cards like Broken Time Space and Forced Vitality explicitly break the rules of evolution, which state that Pokemon can't evolve on your first turn or the turn you put them into play. Despite Forest of Vitality having the restriction it can't be used on the first turn, cards like Broken Time Space and Forest of Giant Plants didn't have these restrictions, and they were both very good in their standard formats. The rule that Pokemon go to the discard pile when knocked out has been broken several times, with cards like Rescue Scarf and Lost City changing where Pokemon go once they're KO'd. Honestly, just about any rule you can think of, it's been broken by some card in the nearly 30 years of Pokemon TCG history. Recycle Energy and U-Turn Board break the rules about energy and tool discards, and Retreat Cost is always being broken left and right. So basically, the only rule that has never changed in any way since the game came out is that you draw 1 card at the start of every turn. It sounds simple, it is simple, and it's part of every single Pokemon game you play, and it comes up multiple times a game. If Pokemon is so content with breaking their own rules over and over again with new groundbreaking cards, why haven't they touched this one yet? Well, the answer is a bit more complicated than you might think. First, drawing a card for turn is just so exciting as a viewer and player of the Pokemon TCG, and it's just part of the brand at this point. Whether it's top decking a boss's orders to win you a game on Pokemon TCG Live, or watching a hype top deck on a tournament live stream, top decks, and by proxy drawing for turn, are exciting for all of us players and viewers of the game. When you get hit with an Iono to 2 or a special red card to 3, you aren't actually limited to 2 or 3 cards, but 3 or 4, because there's always hope from your top deck at the start of your turn. Drawing for turn is just too essential for playing this game, and it's honestly something that I could never imagine the game lacking. But actually, I'm someone who has had first-person experience with doing the closest thing possible to breaking this rule, because there was one small amount of time that this rule wasn't literally broken, but figuratively broken, in the sense that yes, you did still draw a card for turn, but that card was always useless and never mattered. A world where your hand was all that you had, but that hand was always 0 cards, and at best one completely unplayable card of your opponent's choice. And I think examining this small moment in Pokemon TCG history is going to reveal to us the true reason that drawing for turn will never be changed. In the late Sun and Moon era of the Pokemon TCG, it's pretty safe to say that the designers went completely off the rails when designing some of their cards. 300 HP basic 3 prize Pokemon? Check. Copying the attacks of any Pokemon GX or EX, evolved or otherwise, on a 270 HP basic Pokemon? Check. ADP? Yeah, check yet again. But what's missing here? Handlock and permanent hand control, obviously. Bro, come on, how could I forget that? Except it isn't missing and I just lied to you. And the single card that opened our eyes as to how dangerous a world without drawing for turn would be is one of the most broken cards to ever touch the expanded format, Chip Chip Ice Axe. This is an item card that allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck, put one of them on top of their deck, and shuffle the rest back in. So, out of the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck, the odds that they'll have at least one dead card there for the situation are pretty high, meaning you can effectively take their top deck out of the equation and force them to work with just their board and current hand. Is basically the closest thing we've ever had to breaking the rule of drawing for turn, but how strong was this card really? Before that, I do want to note there was a supporter card that came out before Chip Chip Ice Axe called Hiker, which does the exact same thing, but looks at the top 5 instead of the top 3. However, Hiker being a supporter means it's way more limited in its use since you can't combo it with powerful supporter cards to limit your opponent's hand size. So, again, how good was Chip Chip Ice Axe? Well, it was so broken. In Standard, it was a staple of some of the most toxic handlock decks in format history, with a Rangaroo which could infinitely recover resources, Articuno GX which could wipe out your opponent's energy, and an infinite loop of disruption supporters being played 2 times a turn thanks to Lieutenant Surge's strategy, a card that breaks the rule that you can only play 1 supporter each turn. With Reset Stamp, you could force the opponent to very low hand sizes, and with Jesse and James to force their hand size even lower. In Chip Chip Ice Axe to control their top deck, you could dominate an opponent's board with this archetype, and while it never really won many tournaments, it was highly successful in Standard, reaching the top cut of every level of tournament, including the World Championships. But in Expanded, well, that's a completely different story. This card was banned mere months after its release in Expanded because of the most toxic and broken deck in Pokemon history. I just made a full video where I explain and play some games with this deck if you're more interested, but basically this deck would very consistently force the opponent to 0 cards in hand on the very first turn of the game going first. And with Chip Chip Ice Axe being an easy to play item card, you can ensure your opponent had no way out by controlling their top deck. This handlock deck dominated the largest expanded tournament in Japan that year, and shortly after, almost the entire deck was banned for making Expanded unplayable. Normally against handlock decks, you always have some way out. Sometimes with an onboard draw engine, yes, but usually it's just about hoping to top deck something that can get you free. Top decking a research from a would-be 0 card hand is so satisfying as the player and frustrating as the opponent, and that makes the game much more interesting. On the contrary, if there is no way out and you can guarantee a permanent handlock, then the game becomes very uninteractive and one-sided, which is just not fun, like pretty objectively. If their top deck is out of the picture, suddenly having 0 cards in your hand is a death sentence, as you slowly watch all of your Pokemon get knocked out one by one, while you're helpless to do anything to stop it. It's just uninteractive and boring, and in my opinion, bad game design. And Creatures knows this. That's why they banned Chip Chip Ice Axe very early. That's why they stopped printing many cards like it, and it's ultimately why Pokemon's one unbroken rule will stay unbroken forever.